My job isn't very exciting, but it's important to mention since it's the reason I was in Tokyo in the first place. I'm a representative of a huge plane equipment company. I was there on behalf of my CEO, who, well, at this time of the year, was probably getting a nice tan in Hawaii with his family. Christmas was just around the corner, after all. Needless to say, I would have rather been back home with my family instead of trying to sell some new improved seating options for an airplane in Japan. But it was my job, and I couldn't exactly say no. However, I was supposed to be back for the 22nd at the latest, so at least I wasn't going to miss Christmas with my family. I was just going to miss what my 4-year-old considers to be the most important thing ever. The decoration of our Christmas tree. I promised her I was going to get her something special in Japan since I couldn't make it for the big event, and this seemed to calm her down a little bit, and it worked wonders on my wife too. She also made me promise to bring something back for her. Anyway, after a long day and meeting after meeting, I was about ready to go back to my hotel. Japan, while a very nice place to visit as a tourist, is literally hell on earth during rush hour. As I got to the platform and waited for my train, I felt very unnerved, as if someone had been following and looking at me. I blame that on the fact that I was tired, but my gaze ended up wandering to a strange-looking man dressed in all black. I couldn't see his eyes because of his long black hair shielding his gaze from me. The train finally arrived and I got in, but as you would expect a train in Japan, there wasn't a place to sit. By my left was a group of boys fresh out of school playing loudly on their phones and exchanging words that made no sense to me. You see, I knew my way around Japan well enough since I'd been there a couple of times for work, but, well, I never bothered to learn the language. I only ordered food from the hotel and learned the places where I had to stop on the train just to avoid too many taxi fares. The job, well, it paid for the hotel and the food, but I had a very limited budget for transportation, and I wanted to use it for the moment I could decide to buy gifts instead. It was just easier to learn where I'd have to travel and use the train than end up with a transportation bill because my boss was too cheap to pay for it. And plus, a taxi in Japan takes twice if not 3 times as much time to reach its destination, so, well, the train was the best option. Or, well, at least that's what you would think until you actually got on a train in Japan. You see, the mix of smells are strong, plus it's always crowded and hot. It's like 1,000 tiny sardines packed in an even smaller can. You just can't stand in peace. There's always someone on your left. To your right, there's always someone behind you and in front of you, quite literally, shoulder to shoulder. It's not ideal if you're an agoraphobe. The first few times I used the trains, I always felt like I was suffocating. But after 3 or 4 trips, I can now say confidently that I've become a pro at using the train during these hours. But let's go back. I mentioned a weird guy with the long hair. Once I got on the train, I still felt like I was being watched. Around 6 feet to my right, my gaze finally crossed with the man. And let me tell you, I had never seen eyes so red in my entire life. It could have been contacts. There were a lot of different fashion styles in Tokyo, but I didn't feel like this was. I was absolutely captivated by his gaze, not in a loving way. Something about his eyes unsettled me greatly, and each time I tried to pry my gaze from his, I ended up returning to him in a matter of seconds. A loud ding disturbed my thoughts and forced me to look at the station. It wasn't mine. I still had 4 stations to go before mine would come up. The train emptied a little, and I had a little bit more wiggle room, but it was still very crowded. And plus, when I sought the red-eyed man, I couldn't find him. I don't know why I didn't feel reassured in the least. But that's when I felt a hand on my shoulder and heard the deepest, most guttural exhale I'd ever heard in my life. Every hair on my neck stood on end when I turned my head. I was facing the red-eyed guy. I felt like his eyes were piercing my soul. His gaze was so intense that if you asked me today what the rest of his face looked like, I wouldn't be able to answer that. I also, I couldn't tear my eyes away from his. I tried to move a muscle to at least get him to release my shoulder, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed. I was frozen in fear. And just then, a loud screech and an even deeper vibration shook the train, and I heard a scream coming from the front of the car. There was an announcement in Japanese over the intercom, and the train started shaking even more. It seemed like we were picking up speed as well. I still couldn't move. It was like I was trapped by the red eyes staring at me, staring straight into my soul. The train kept picking up speed and people were screaming. Every time the train shook, someone was catapulted off their seat. The sound of glass breaking was heard as a poor teenage boy was sent flying toward the glass door. The impact had been so strong, his head shattered the glass panes. He was still alive and conscious, but he was bleeding profusely. The voices on the speaker became louder, and I finally managed to free my gaze from the red-eyed stranger, just in time to realize that we hadn't turned. I heard the sound of metal clashing against metal, of human agony as flames and metal engulfed the cabins of the front. Everything happened so fast. I saw a metal bar flying to my right and stabbing a woman in the chest. Seconds before the crash finally reached us, and we were engulfed in flames. I felt my skin burn, and I smelled other people's charred flesh for long enough that the smell stuck to my nose. And then I heard myself scream. And then I woke up. I was holding one of the many handlebars so tightly, my knuckles had turned completely white. A woman and her child on my left, they were looking at me strangely. She held her child even closer as I looked back at him. I could feel that I was covered in sweat from forehead to ass, and I nearly dry heaved when the stench of burning flesh re-entered my nostrils again. There was another squeeze on my shoulder. I only had the time to look at the flashing indicator to know that we were still 3 stations left before I could get out. And instinctively, I turned my head to see who was squeezing my shoulder. That was a big mistake. The eyes were even more intense than they were before the first vision. I had to assume it was a vision, because the woman whose chest had been impaled was standing right in front of me, breathing and looking pretty blasé about life, but very much alive. Not that I could look at her anymore, because the moment I set my eyes on those intense red eyes, I knew I wouldn't be able to escape. I couldn't see the rest of his face, but I felt like he was smiling at me. Inwardly, I could feel the malevolence and evilness, and I imagined a smile. I was about to try and say something when I heard the first gunshot noise tore through the atmosphere. I heard a loud scream and saw blood, and then a desperate man holding what looked like a semi-automatic weapon. I'm not an expert, but that definitely wasn't a handgun. and it looked exactly like one of those guns you see in an action movie that shoots 12 bullets in under a second. Definitely not an expert on the subject, but I felt an intense fear growing in my guts. The shooter turned in the other direction and started shooting. I saw literal pieces of human brains being splattered across the cabins, and I was frozen in my place, while people in my own cabin tried to run away from the shooter, who seemed busy with the other direction. But it would only last so long until he was done with that side. He turned around and his eyes were just as red, if not redder than the man forcing me to witness all of this. A few more bullets were shot, and I felt the warmth of the blood of the woman and her daughter as it splattered across my chest and face. I finally reacted and turned around to try and run away as a flurry of bullets flew around me. I was hit in the back 3 times, my legs twice. I felt the bullet as it pierced through my flesh and burned its way through my abdomen. I tasted blood as I saw others panicking, and felt feet literally walking all over me to try and escape the shooter. It felt very real, and I was convinced I was going to die. I tried to tell myself it was fake, but I could feel my consciousness slipping and cold seeping through my veins. I saw my blood leave my body by the liters, and my alertness flicker. I coughed up blood and I lost consciousness. When I came back to, my knees trembled, and I was still holding onto that bar. The ding announced that there were 2 more stations left before I could get out, and I wanted to get out now. I tried to take a step forward, but nearly tripped. The man with red eyes grabbed my shoulders, and I could see the little girl's worried gaze on me. I wanted to tell her and everyone that they needed to get out of the train, but again, I was trapped in my own body. I straightened myself and could still smell the burnt flesh from the first vision, feel the pain and the bullet wounds from the second. I stared back at the red-eyed man, ready to implore him to let me get off the train. My whole vision turned red. It was like I'd gone blind. But then the woman holding her daughter coughed. I looked back and the man with red eyes wasn't there anymore. My mouth dried up instantly. The woman coughed again, this time a little stronger. Her daughter screamed loudly, and I noticed her hair and face were covered in blood. A second later, her mother was crashing down to the floor of the train and was having seizures. People formed a circle around her as she vomited blood, but it didn't last. A second passenger started coughing, and then a third. The woman was still convulsing and vomiting on the ground. Her eyes remained closed as her daughter shook her. I could feel the helplessness of her daughter as she screamed in her own tongue and cried for help. Now, I might not know Japanese, but agony is a universal language. Her mother reopened her eyes, only for them to start bulging out of their sockets. At this point, I grabbed the little girl and shoved her face in my stomach. Her mother's face was turning purple as a cacophony of coughs and retching happened in the background. Everywhere I looked, people were vomiting blood or falling to their knees. They looked like they were suffocating. The little girl's mother's eyes exploded, and a mixture of eye fluids and blood splattered warmly across my hand as I kept her in my stomach. Her mother's body kept being jerked by spasms for a few minutes. Then, she stopped moving. And then I heard the tiniest of coughs on my stomach. Then another, followed by a warm stream that went from my stomach to my leg. I pulled the little girl away, and the lower half of her face was covered in blood. Her face was warm and sweaty. I'm not ashamed to say that I pushed her away from me and took a step back, only to trip on a body that had been done convulsing. The coughing around me was subsiding as more people started to die. But I saw this little girl vomit at least 4 times her weight in blood before the same thing that happened to her mother happened to her. I couldn't believe my eyes, and I saw the man with red eyes as the very few last men standing started to fall. And then I felt an itch on the back of my throat. I coughed once, then twice, and then I felt like every breath I took was like inhaling miniature daggers covered in tiny flames. Breathing made my lungs burn, and I could feel them filling with blood. I coughed into my palm, and there it was. My blood. All I could smell anymore was blood. The train car was filled with it. I tried to hold on to the handlebar and move through the cabin, but my foot slipped on some of the gore and vomit, and I fell face first onto the floor. That's when I felt my body seize. I lost control of my muscles and started coughing like crazy. My vision blurred and my whole body was in a tremendous amount of pain. I felt myself slipping off into the blackness. I rolled on my back and lost consciousness. And then I woke up again, but this time, I wasn't on the train. I was back on the platform. I was covered in sweat and shaking like a leaf. When I turned, the man was there, but I couldn't see his eyes. I decided not to take the train. I went back outside and gestured for a taxi. I went back to my hotel in 3 times the amount of time it would have taken me if I had taken the train, but all I wanted was not to be surrounded by a ton of people. When I entered my hotel room, I made my way to my bathroom, and believe it or not, I vomited until I felt like my entire body was empty. I could still smell the charred flesh of the passengers. My abdomen was in a great amount of pain from where I'd been shot, and the back of my throat was itching like crazy. I had to drag my body to bed, and I slept for 11 hours. When I woke up, it was all over the news. The train yesterday had malfunctioned and crashed, causing the death of 73 passengers and wounding 129. That was the train I was supposed to be on. I packed up my stuff, and I called my boss, and I said I was coming home. That something happened, and I was coming home. Aside from using the airplane to get home, I haven't used public transportation since then, and I haven't set foot in Japan either.